Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about adding value to clients while planning for death, and of course we're going to be launching our first iteration of our estate planning calculators. And I think over the last few weeks, as we've been spending more time on this topic and we've been engaging with a lot of you on it, I think what we've realized is that it's a lot broader than we initially thought. There are so many things to consider, so many things to take into account. So we hope today to share some of the insights that we've gathered along this journey. And thank you for all of you for engaging with us and for your input in it. And if we start by, thinking about planning in the event of death and traditionally what that looks like. And for me, what stood out for me is it's, based on a snapshot of where the client is today. It's static, a lot of the times high level, and very focused on the calculations, optimizing them, reducing them, driven by whether the client has a will or not. And what we've seen is that the problem with this approach is that you can have a client with a perfect plan that has, enough cover, has enough investments, has a will in place, you've optimized all the calcs, and yet it could be a disaster and be derailed by something else that happens. And I'm going to share some stories around that as well. And the reason is we need to start by saying, let's really understand the client's need and then optimize the rest to meet that need. And the real importance is engaging around what that need is. And I want to share, through this journey of discovery over the last few weeks and just some anecdotal input that we've had from planners, I'm going to share some real stories of circumstances or experiences that planners have had with clients where these plans and how they can be derailed. And one is if we think about, wills, we have wills week and we see a lot of clients building wills in that time, but often these remain static. They're not reviewed, they're not updated, they don't change with the client's circumstances, they're not necessarily done with the planner, and that can cause disastrous effects down the line. It's also an example of a client that's an entrepreneur going through COVID the last few years, like many entrepreneurs faced, cash flow and financial difficulty. This individual had decided to refinance certain things, but did not consult with their planner or their spouse. So nobody knew about it. Unfortunately, he passed away. And even though having the best plan in place, because of these changes he made in the last year, it completely derailed the plan. Then we had an example where a client had, is a sole proprietor and had a business, passed away, and he did have a will in place. It was with one of the banks, and the bank contacted the widow to say, we'll appoint an executor in 6 weeks. In that 6-week time, that nobody could manage the cash flow in the business. It meant that debit orders bounced, including insurance premiums. There was inability to pay staff, inability to pay SARS, and again, completely derailed the plan, not to mention the stress that it caused for the spouse. And in that situation, she actually needed to keep his phone on in order just to get the SMSs to track what debit orders were going off. I mean, that's the extent to which it can get to. Other things we see is that often clients have loans to family members, but it's not documented appropriately. Other things is children, having children in all over the country, in different countries, which means you now have to contend with different jurisdictions. It's hard to coordinate everyone. It's hard to communicate with them. Clients also have multiple bank accounts. Some clients have bank accounts with 3 or 4 different banks just because of the nature of changes over their lifetime. And nobody has any idea that all these bank accounts exist and they exist across these different banks. And probably a really interesting one I heard recently is an issue that's coming up with spouses that have joint wills, where one spouse passes away, the original joint will is handed in, and when the second spouse passes away, the will has been lost in in one of the offices. And now the client doesn't have a will. And this plan in particular is saying, I'm actually encouraging clients to do separate wills now to prevent this from happening in the future. So just if we think about these stories, and it just shows that a plan can be in place, but there's so many considerations and things that we need to think about. It really is if you look at it, just kind of a messy space, where things are changing all the time. Clients' property values change all the time. Our loan accounts change all the time. And maybe that's another example I'd like to share, is a client that, was medically uninsurable. And everything was fine until, in the last year, his accountant for his business and him decided to take out a loan instead of being paid for that year. So in effect, he owed the company money. And it would have been fine if he wasn't uninsurable, but now there was no space to rectify that, which resulted in, inability to honor the legacy that he wanted to leave, for his family. So these things change all the time, especially in environments where clients have businesses. Those financials are changing rapidly, and we need to be able to keep up to date with that in order to ensure that our plan can still remain intact. And this messy world of things changing, it's almost this idea that where reality and planning meets is a messy space, no matter what plans we put in place. And this constant change, if we think a few years ago, we wouldn't have to consider things like digital assets, whether the client has Bitcoin and which wallet that's in, or social media accounts. We need to understand, what does the client want to do with their Facebook, their Twitter, all of their social media if something happens to them. I mean, I've had my own experience where someone's passed away and a year later you receive a friend request from them, and that's simply because the account wasn't closed and someone hacked into the profile. So the world is, the environment of which we're looking at is changing. The client's circumstances are changing constantly, and our plans need to be able to take all of this into account. So in thinking about all of these things and thinking about where they fit in over the last few weeks, what we've tried to do is put it into a framework, a starting point where we can start the conversation with all of you to say, what framework works, what fits where, and how can we ensure that we're covering all of these bases when planning in the event of death with clients. And for those of you that have come to our presentations before, that when I say framework, I'm specifically talking about a Venn diagram. So here we have one for, how we can be planning for death and making sure that it's valuable. And as always, it starts with the people. So, from a people point of view, I like this one too, because it's a bit of alliteration with people, planning, and process. But if we start with the people, we need to understand who are the people in this client's life that are important to them. And I know that, we talk about this all the time by showing all of the people that's important. But we also need to understand, what is the legacy that this client wants to achieve? And legacy is always, for me, a great question to gain understanding of a person, because everyone you ask about legacy will have a different answer. What I want as a legacy versus someone else is always different. Most importantly, what are their needs in the event of death? What would they need to achieve? What would their family need in order to sustain the lifestyle that they have? Who else should we be including in the conversation? Often clients have other advisors, whether it's an accountant advisor or a tax advisor, and how do we bring all of these people into the conversation and work as a team on that? And how do we hold clients accountable to say, this plan is based on this information. If these things change or I don't know about it, I can't incorporate it into the plan. So really holding clients accountable to the plan as well. And if we can shift to the bottom left and look at planning, this is where we really need to understand the need of the client. And, during a consultation with one of the planners said, that need you can really break down into small sections. What are the needs going to be for day one when somebody passes away? What about the first week, the first month, the first year? So we can really go into, the detail there to unpack what that journey is going to look like for the client. Or for the family when someone passes away. And then, of course, optimizing the calculations in line with the need. And this is always an important specific point, is that we want to optimize the calculations, but it must be in line with the need, which means that you could have a situation where the client could be paying less executive fees or estate duty, but by doing that, it will prevent the client from achieving the need. So always need first, and then optimize the calcs in line with that. And then, of course, bridging the gap. What can we do differently? And often, this requires products. Maybe it's life cover or changes, but it also requires structural changes. Maybe we need to update beneficiaries on certain things, or move more things to the estate, or look at trust. So there's the planning side, and the planning is more than just the calculations. Okay. On the process side, and this is where, how long is a piece of string in terms of all the things that can fit into this category. But it's about really managing the client's data, where they are at all the time, what changes have happened, and what it looks like today. And comparing the outcome to say, does this outcome meet the need? And each time we review it, comparing whether it still meets the need. There's a lot of document management that sits in this space. Who has the original will? Who has the other documents, the contracts, marital contracts that's going to be needed? Then there's the softer side. It's not just about a will, but also a living will. Is the client an organ donor? Have they registered if they are? What digital assets do they have? What social media accounts do they have, and what are their wishes for those? And able to start and oversee that process on death. That also fits into them. And I think if we think about financial planning and planning for death, we tend to see more concentration on this planning quadrant. But in order to really add more value to clients, we need to expand it to all of these. And I know that there's a lot, it's a lot of things to look at. And I think on the process side, there's a big opportunity there to say, how can we do this in a more scalable way so that we can offer it to more clients and more people can benefit from that. But today we're going to focus in this planning side on those estate planning calculations. But before we do that, why? Why would planners want to broaden, broaden to looking at all of those components? And some of you may already be looking, at all of those components. But the reasons why is that it deepens the relationship with the client. And we're always looking for ways to add more value. And there's something really valuable in expanding that conversation. It also gives us the ability to differentiate ourselves and to build relationships with not just the client and maybe the spouse, but the entire family. Bill Bacharach says that 90% of widows don't stay with their deceased spouse planner. So we need to be able to build relationships with the entire family and change that around. Okay. But as I said, we're going to focus today just on, this first iteration of the estate planning calculations. We've added these calculators to the WORK.THAT.MATTERS website. And the idea is that you can go on, quickly complete a few details and calculate the estate duty, executive fees, capital gains tax applicable, and take the results and put them into asset map and target maps to have the really important part of this, which is the conversation with the client around, if that's the result, what do we do? What is the plan? What is the need? I'm going to flip over into one of the calculators now. We've got one for, antenuptial contracts and one for married in community of property. And I'm just going to work through this antenuptial one today. You'll see the first section asks you just to fill in the client's name, and if you'd like, you can do it for client and spouse together. So you can fill in the spouse's name. You'll see then it asks for some additional information, just in terms of the will. Is residue going to spouse? Is it with or without accrual? So you'd fill that in here. If it is with accrual, you'd fill in a bit more details about the accrual. And then you'd fill in data required for the client and data required for the spouse if you're looking at both client and spouse. And you'll see when you click on the data required for the client, the first thing you'll notice is it asks for total property and business assets that will be sold in the event of death and assets that will not be sold in the event of death. And for each of those, it asks the amount, the base cost, and in terms of, who is it going to? Is it bequeathed some of it to the spouse, some to others, and how much is going to the estate? Now, the reason we've split these two up is because it has implications. If the asset is going to be sold and it's going to the spouse, there's still CGT. Whereas if it's not being sold and it's going to the spouse, there isn't CGT. So you'll see these separations are very deliberate in order to do those calculations. Then it looks at discretionary assets. And again, it could be bequeathed to spouse or other in terms of the will or going into the estate. You'll see endowments separate, and the reason for that is whilst endowments still, are eligible for estate duty, if there are beneficiaries other than the estate, then there's no executor's fees on there. So that's why that's separated, and life cover is separated out for similar reasons. Depending on who it's going to, has an impact on the COGS. But those are the things that you complete, as well as liabilities. That's all the inputs required. You can also do the spouse, and then what it'll do is automatically calculate the capital gains tax for both the client, the spouse, and in the event of simultaneous death. It shows all the calculations here, just that you can see that and be comfortable with how it's calculating. It also shows you the executor's fees for the client, the spouse, and in the event of simultaneous death, and the same for estate duty. But what you really need to look at is this last section, which is the outcome. And here it just summarizes what the total estate duty, executives fees, CGT, and that total, and then with liabilities, what that total is for both the client, the spouse, and in simultaneous death. And then those figures can be taken into asset map, reflected in target maps to have the conversation with the client. So I'm going to do a live example now of just how you would use this in practice with the client. Okay. So I'd like to introduce you to the Carters, Carter family. And we can see at the top here, the first thing is adding all of the people. So we've got Byron and his wife, Kathy. They've got 2 kids, Jennifer and Zach. Their accountant is Joe Jenkins. So I've added him here because I want to be able to see and bring in all the people that are important to the client, or all the people that are advising the client. You can also see that they've got a business over here. Now, when I add the people, I can also stipulate, their relationship to the client. So you can see here, I've added in that Jennifer is the client's daughter. And by adding it in here under the detail section, so just clicking on the person, selecting the detail section and adding it in here, it also shows that information on the PDF. So if we look at the PDF here, you can see at the top, it says daughter, son, accountant, and whatever I've stipulated in that section. So we want to bring all the people into the picture. Then if we have a look at the Carters, we can see in this case, Byron is a business owner. So we've added the business as an asset under Byron, and he has got a loan account. So we've brought in that he owes the business this $850,000. We can also see that they've got other investments, retirement funds. On Kathy's side, there's some property and also loans and investments. And what I've done here as well is for each of these different investments and insurances, I've added who the beneficiary is. And to do that, you click on the block, and under the details tab, you can select who the beneficiary is and also what percentage they're going to be receiving. But the big question here is, for this example, I'm going to focus on in the event of death of Byron. So the first step is to understand what is the need in the event of death for Byron. And when you look at the target maps here, you'll see that I've created 2, one for liquidity and one for income required. And the reason for that is you could do it under one target map, but I always think planning in the event of death is really about 2 separate conversations. One is saying you need a certain amount of liquidity in order to cover the costs applicable to death, perhaps to cover loans that you want to settle immediately, and any income or funding you're going to require for that initial period. You want that to be easily accessible and liquid, that you can access that quickly should something happen. And then there's a separate conversation to say, but what will the family need to sustain their lifestyle should something happen to you? So in this case, I've split it just to really show the difference between the 2. But if we have a look here under this liquidity required, what I've listed as what the client needs or wants is funding for the first 6 months, and I've put an amount in here. I've said that they would like to cover all debts, so not just Byron's, but also Kathy's, and they'd like to settle that as quickly as possible. And then I've put a line item here for estate duty, executive fees, and capital gains tax. Now, I could have made this 3 separate lines, but I think the client just wants to understand what the costs are going to be. So I've added it as one line, but you could do it in either way. And of course, this amount is R1 because we're going to go calculate it together now using a calculator. That's the one need. Then the other need on the income side, you can see that I've shown as income required, and that's from Kathy's age now till 90, and some education expenses as the kids are both still studying. Now, I've done a quite high level in here, but with target maps, you can go into any amount of detail. So you could look at first year's requirement, then the next 5 years. Maybe it's different after Kathy's 80 and you account for that. So that you can really go into the detail of what they need and spit it out exactly, all those different needs in this section here. But those are the two goals. We want the liquidity to cover those things, and we want to provide for income, and we're going to have a look at how we take that next step. Now, in order to do the calculations in the estate planning calculator, I like to use the beneficiary report as a way to get all the information I need to populate that calculator. So you see, if I click on the beneficiary report, just to show you what this report shows you, is it's saying for Byron at the top here, these are all Byron's assets, liabilities, and insurances. And here in the columns, it shows you, based on the beneficiaries you've selected, what is unassigned and going into the estate, what is going to Kathy's spouse, what's going to Jennifer, and what's going to Jack. Okay. And this is a great report to show and open up that legacy, parts of that legacy conversation as well. To say, this is what everyone will receive. Does this reflect what you were hoping for, or do we need to make changes? But it's also a great report to get the information you need to do the calculations. So we can see on here that Byron has a retirement annuity that he wants to go to Kathy. His business, however, he wants to go to his son. He's got a savings investment, and currently that'll go into the estate. And the idea is for that to provide the liquidity. We're going to check whether that's going to be sufficient or not. He's also got an endowment where he's listed beneficiaries being his children, 50-50. Then from a liabilities point of view, we know he's got this loan. And this is another great way of highlighting, loans from, in businesses, and showing it in here to say, this still has to be accounted for in the event of death and settled. So how do we plan around that? And we can see his life cover over here, 4.2 million, and that is going to the spouse. So now we can use this information and flip over to our estate duty calculators to calculate the impact. I put in the client's name, Byron Carter. Of course, I could also look at Kathy's assets and based on who she's allocated them to and work that out. But just for the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to focus on Byron. Additional information, I'm going to assume that's not residue to spouse and that there is no accrual, but I could update that if I wanted to. And then from the data required, total property and business assets that will be sold. No, he is not selling the business, it's going to his son. So I'm going to put that amount in here. And if I have a look at that beneficiaries report, I can see that the business is 6.5 million. So I'm going to put that 6.5 million in here. And it's all being bequeathed to others. It's not going to the spouse, not going into the estate. Okay. If I look at discretionary assets and have a look at what they have in that space, we know that they've got the savings investment of 3.1 million and that is going to the estate. So I can fill that in. Oh, and also I'm just assuming that we don't know the base cost, but obviously we could fill that in and it'll bring that into the calculation as well. But I'm going to do worst case scenario and say we don't know what that is. So this 3.1 million is going into the estate. Then endowments, we know he's got one for 960,000, and that is also going to other people, not the spouse, not the estate. He's got 4.2 million in life cover, and the spouse is the beneficiary there. And from a liabilities point of view, he's got 850,000 in liabilities. I fill in that information, and then if I scroll down, here you can see it's calculating what's eligible, base cost, exemptions, and actual CGT. Same for executives fees, and same for estate duty. But what I'm interested in is this outcome section. So here I can see I can split it, or I could say, that's the total, that's the amount I'm looking for to go plug into target maps so I can facilitate the conversation. So now I can flip back into asset map, go back into target maps, open up this first one here, and under this section, I'm going to paste in that amount. Now the conversation becomes, well, if this is what the client needs, for the family from a liquidity point of view, they would need to have 5 million in liquidity available. What do they have? Well, we know that we've got the savings investment of parents for 3.1 million. So I'm going to allocate that to the liquidity goal. And what it's telling me is in the event of death, there's a liquidity shortfall. Now, there's many ways that we could address this. It could be reallocating assets, restructuring, changing needs, or life cover. But the idea is this is the conversation we need to have with the client. How do we address this liquidity issue in the event of death? And now if I look at the income requirements, and now I can allocate what the client has in respect that can be allocated towards, sustaining the lifestyle for the family. So I can select the retirement annuity. I'll select Kathy's savings account because we're using it for her lifetime. Can't select this savings because that is being used for liquidity. I wouldn't select the home. I would select the education fund. The endowment and the business are going to the children. So again, this is the outcome in the income required. But as we know, there are many different ways to address that too, and we could then explore those options with the client. But, oh, sorry, and I didn't tick the life cover. Hold on, and I'd select the life cover. Okay. And now I can look at both of these and say, that's the liquidity deficit, and this is the deficit for sustaining the family's lifestyle in the event of death. And those could be two separate conversations or one conversation to address both of those. Okay. Okay. So those are the estate planning calculations, and later on today you'll get an email with everything you need to get started. But we have been running a beta for the last couple of weeks. I just want to thank everyone that has been working through it for sending your feedback. We made a couple of changes already. Some other changes that have been requested is, the ability to, go back to one you've already done. So as a, first starting point there, we're looking at creating a PDF so you can download it and save it and refer back to it as and when you need. And then you've also got a record of what the inputs were, what the calcs were, what the outcome was, and then we'll reassess and see whether further changes need to happen. Other things that have been suggested is, ability to add extra costs that may come out, and also to be able to change certain assumptions. So we are going to look at that. We're committed to working with you and making the changes that, make this valuable for everyone. So please continue to send your input and your feedback, and let us know how we can, really make it valuable for you. Okay. And then if we go to this screen, just how can Asset Map, support these different areas? And it's broad and there's a lot of things, but what are the areas where Asset Map can really add value to these different sections? And I think under the people section, we know it's important to show all the people on the map. Here we can do that in Asset Map by showing all the important people, showing all the entities, how the financials link to that, bring everyone into the conversation, spouse, children, accountant, tax advisors, and leave clients feeling, I feel cared for. That section leaves clients with that feeling, I feel cared for. Then if we think on the planning side, we can show all the needs in target maps. We can engage with the clients on both liquidity and family needs. It's really where the calculations and the analysis meet. And there we want to leave clients feeling, I feel understood. On the process side, Asset Map encourages conversations on changes. The beneficiary report is great to show clients who's receiving what and to inform further steps. Notes, you can use notes a lot to link to different documents or show who has access to certain documents, who's keeping them, so that you have that information when needed. You can also add estates as a member in a household, and I'll take you through an example of that now, where you can show the debit orders that are coming off, show the client's digital assets, social media accounts, and of course this estate duty calculator we think can really enable that process side. So let me just quickly flip back into here. I just want to show you an example of how you could add estates as a separate entity on a client's map. And by doing that, you can actually show a list of debit orders. So if I click on that, I can select notes and see all the debit orders that are coming off for that client. I can add notes around whether they're an organ donor. I can add the executive's details, the will, living will, and any social media, and who has the passwords to, update that or change that. So by doing this, you can really create a picture of, what are the things in that process space that we need to be aware of, that we need to be checking in with clients on and updating as required. Then lastly, I just want to say thank you again for joining today. This afternoon, we'll be sending you an email with everything you need to get started to use the cogs. Please do use them, send us feedback, send us your inputs. And we wish you on these last few weeks of 2021, we hope they're great weeks for you and you end the year well. And we've got some exciting things coming in the first quarter of next year, not only on estate planning, but also the much anticipated asset map signals will be coming in the first quarter of next year. So stay tuned. And yeah, can't wait to hit the year running with all of you. Penny, Gary, I'm going to hand over to you in case there are questions.